Morning, everybody. In 1989, an earthquake struck the small country of Armenia. And in that 4-minute window that the earthquake struck, over 30,000 people lost their lives. On that day, a father knew his son was at school, and so after everything had stopped shaking, he ran to the school looking for his son. And standing there, looking at what was left of the building, because it was just flattened, he remembered this promise that he made to his boy. No matter what, I will always be there for you. And as tears began to fill his eyes, and as he looked at the hopeless situation, he could not take his mind off that promise. No matter what, I will always be there for you. Remembering that his son's classroom was at the back of the school on the right-hand side, he walked over there as fast as he could get there and started digging through the rubble, pulling stone after stone off. As he was doing that, other parents arrived at the scene, and many of them, full of grief, clutching their hearts, would yell out, "Oh, my son," or "Oh, my daughter." And they would come to him and saying, "It's too late. What are you doing? Just go home." Even a policeman and a firefighter came and told him that he should just go home. But in response to their question or in response to their comments, he would just say, "Are you going to help me now?" And he would just keep digging, taking stone after stone off by his hands, because he needed to know whether his boy was alive or whether he was dead. The man dug for 8 hours. That 8 turned into 12. Then 24, then 36. Finally, at the 38th hour of straight digging by hand, he pulled back a boulder and he heard his son's voice. He screamed, "Armand!" And this is what he heard: Dad, it's me." And then the boy added these words: "I told the other kids not to worry. I told them that if you were alive, you would save me. And when you saved me, you would save them. You promised, Dad, no matter what, you said, I will always be there for you. And here you are, Dad. You kept your promise." How does one man continue to dig when others don't? How does a father continue to hope when others have given up? What drives a person to keep their word, to remember their promise and not be swayed by others or circumstances? How do you faithfully carry on, pulling off rock after rock after rock for hours and hours on end, not sure that you will even succeed? How do you do that? It's interesting. The Bible asks this question in Proverbs 20, verse 6. It says, "But a faithful person who can find?" Who can find a faithful person? You see, keeping our promises is really easy when it doesn't cost us anything. Living a life of integrity, no problem when the price tag is low, right? But to be faithful, when everything goes wrong, to continue to carry on and do what you've committed to do, that seems to be an entirely different story. It is really hard to live right when life goes terribly wrong, isn't it? We are continuing our series in Joseph today, and so if you have your Bibles, I want you to flip over to chapter 39 of Genesis, or open up your YouVersion and hit chapter 39. You're going to have to keep your finger here or it on your tablet or your phone, because we're going to come to it and then go away and then come back to it. But I want to start by just reading the first few verses. Remember last time when we left Joseph last week, he was where? He was on his way to Egypt. His brothers had sold him. His cousins were gladly taking him to Egypt to sell him again into slavery. And so this is what it says. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes, and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So he left in Joseph's care everything he had. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. We're introduced to Potiphar here, and it tells us that Potiphar is one of Pharaoh's officials, meaning that Potiphar was a powerful man. He knew the king, Pharaoh. It also tells us that, depending on your translation, he is either the captain of the guard or the captain of the bodyguards. Some commentators, even looking at his name, would suggest that the right way to say it, he was actually the chief of the executioners. He was in charge of getting rid of Pharaoh's enemies, or protecting Pharaoh, however you want to look at it. Anyways, Pharaoh had a lot of trust in him. He was an important guy. He was. He was probably military trained. He was a man used to seeing death. He was a man used to discipline. And he was probably a very hard man. And in this passage, you see two things going on. You see God's part and you see Joseph's part. And in God's part, right away in verse 2, the writer tells us, so we're not worried for Joseph, that God was with Joseph. And then it adds something, and he prospered him. And I want to make sure that, and we're going to get into this a little later, those two things aren't the same. Just because God is with you does not guarantee that he will prosper you. Okay, so we're not selling that bill this morning, okay? But there's two things here. God was with Joseph, and he prospered him. Joseph, it tells us, was a guy who seemed to thrive in this situation. Think about it for a minute. 17-year or 18-year-old boy, he's supposed to be completing high school this year. And yet he finds himself a slave. He's carted off to a new country where he doesn't know the language, he doesn't know the culture, and he's going from rural life, where his dad is raising goats and sheep, to being a slave in the household of an official for Pharaoh. I don't think you could get two very different perspectives on life other than those two things. And here Joseph is plunked right into the middle, and it seems that Joseph looks at this new challenge in his life, not only as a slave, but now he has to adjust to a whole new culture, whole new way of living, and he takes it on. I would suggest that he learns the language, that he learns their customs, so that he can fit in with them. And he does it so well that Pharaoh takes notice, and it tells us that God is part of that. I also wonder if, as we looked at last week, his training at home. Remember, Joseph wasn't sent out to the fields with his brothers. He was left at home, and I wonder if he received some training about running households. Because his dad was planning on Joseph taking over the family, wasn't he? In order to do that, you have to know how to run a large family, a large enterprising business. And so I wonder if those couple of things helped Joseph, when he landed in this new situation, to start operating with the gifts that he had and the training he had already had, and God takes that, blesses him, and prospers him, and it tells us that Potiphar notices. It doesn't say that Joseph trumped his own trumpet. It doesn't say, hey, look at me, I can do this. It says that Joseph was there. Potiphar noticed that whatever Joseph was put in charge of or did, it turned out pretty good. And then, at the very end of verse 6 there, it tells us one other thing. That Joseph is Magic Mike hot. Ladies, he was easy on the eyes. That's what it says. In fact, in the Old Testament, there are only 3 other guys that are talked about that way. King Saul, King David, and King David's son Absalom. Joseph's the first one of those 4. Apparently, he was very good looking. And his physique was to die for. I wondered if that played into anything of the jealousy that the brothers had as well. I mean, think about it. Your little brother is the most handsome, the best fit out of the whole family. They already had a problem. And here he is. He's in this situation, and he's doing well. What is interesting to note is that Satan doesn't come and attack Joseph because of his successes. Satan uses his hotness to try and cause him to fall. Look at verse 7. 7. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." I think that gives you pretty much all you need to know about the wife. She is a direct person, is she not? There's no beating around the bush with her. But this is what Joseph did. Verse 8, but he refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in this house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I. My master has withheld nothing from me except you because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. If you look back in the previous verses, you'll notice a progression. When Joseph was placed in the house and Potiphar started to see how good he was at things, it says that he made him his attendant. And then after that, he put in charge the whole household. And then that wasn't good enough. He gave him everything. So much so that all Potiphar had to worry about was lifting the fork from his plate into his mouth. That's all he did. When he came home from work, all he had to worry about was lifting the fork. Lifting the fork. Let me ask you, how much trust would you have to have in a person in order to turn over everything in your life to that person to run for you? All your investments, all your properties, all your household running, all your budgets, everything. How much trust would you have to have in that person? And that person's not in your family. It's not your spouse. It's someone you bought at the local market. I think sometimes we gloss over that fact. And we think when we read the words God was with Joseph, that it just magically happened, that suddenly things started happening and then Joseph was just magically put in charge of something. I would suggest to you this morning that part of why Joseph was successful and why God looked with favor upon him, other than the big picture of God and God had a plan for where Joseph had to end up, was that Joseph was a man of integrity. And part of what Potiphar saw in Joseph was, I can trust this man. I can trust him. I can trust him with everything in my life. So much so that I just have to come home, lift my fork, and eat my dinner. That's all I got to worry about when I get home from work. That's it. And then you have his wife. Apparently, she doesn't even rank us knowing her name, other than it's the wife. And in verse 11, it says, one day he went into the house to attend his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, come to bed with me. And he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. Look, she said to them, this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him the story. That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, this is how your slave treated me, he burned with anger. You see, faithfulness does not mean a life without temptation. It doesn't. And you can live your life with integrity to the highest level, but don't expect to go through life without temptation. And in Joseph's case, he was minding his own business, doing what he was doing, placed where he was, which he had no control over, but he was just doing what he could do, succeeding at it because God was blessing him, and then he runs into a problem, and it's his master's wife, Potiphar's wife. And she persists. She's determined. She is a seductress. She is driven to have sex with Joseph. She doesn't care about her own marriage. She doesn't care about anything else. She sees what she wants, and she is going after it. Joseph refuses, and he gives two reasons. He says, one, because he's loyal to his master. He's a man of integrity. Look, Potiphar has placed me in this position. He's given me control over everything except for you. You're his wife. And not only that, it would be wrong against my God. It would be a sin against God for me to do what you are suggesting. And he takes those two things as his foundation for refusing her. And you need to notice that this just wasn't a one-time deal. She continued to try and take him to bed over and over and over and over again, to the place where he finally says, you know what, I can't control her, but I can control my schedule. So I will make sure that I will try and not be around her as much as possible. And it seems to work for a while. He continues to live his life, continuing to do and running the household for Potiphar. And she, whenever she gets the chance, continues to try and tempt him until that one fateful day when no one is there. We don't know if she sent everyone away, thinking, hey, I got a plan. I'll just make sure no one's here. Then I can get him. But on that day, again, the temptation comes. And so this morning, part of what I need to talk about, because this passage brings it up, is dealing with temptation. And in order to be faithful, in order to live a life right, even when things go wrong, we have to understand that you are going to face temptation throughout your life. And just because you resist temptation once doesn't mean it will vanish from your life. It doesn't. And in this case, it's a sexual temptation. There are other temptations. You know that. There's material temptations when we lust after things that we don't have. There is personal temptations where we lust after positions of power or positions of authority or titles. We want something that someone else has, and so we lust after it. Then, of course, there's the sensual temptations that, whether it's pornography, whether it's adultery, whether it's someone else's wife, whether it's someone that you really have no business wanting. James tells us that when we are tempted, our lust is aroused. And if we don't deal with that lust, the wanting of something that is not ours or shouldn't be ours, it will carry us away, James tells us, and ultimately leading into death. And so let me ask you this morning, what are the things in your life that are tempting you? What are the areas in your life that you know that you would be prone to falling or succumbing to? Or maybe this morning you're here and you go, Brent, you know what? This week was not a good week for me. I gave in pretty bad. I did things I know I shouldn't have done. For those of you who are struggling with the sexual side of temptation, I encourage you, we did a message back in February in our Taboo series. And it was a whole message on pornography. And if that is your temptation, and I'm talking to both men and women, because it's not a one gender temptation. Both men and women struggle with pornography. I encourage you to go back to that in February and listen to that message. We just don't have time to deal with that this morning. But we do have time to look at how Joseph handled his temptation. Even though he could not remove the temptation, and I think that's important. He could not remove where he lived. He could not remove his responsibilities. He could not change his job. Because that's usually what we do is, right? We say, well, if you have a temptation, just get away from it. Don't go near it. But what happens when our temptation, we can't actually leave? Joseph could not leave his temptation. What he tried to do was manage around it. And so what he did was to find ways where he wouldn't be with her one-on-one. He could control his schedule, he just couldn't control her. And so he was successful at that until one day it comes to a point where no one's in the house and she becomes even more direct. And what does she do? The Bible tells us she grabbed him. It's no longer just words. It actually becomes physical. She grabs him and holds him so tight that when he backs away from her, his cloak actually comes off in her hand. And what does he do? He doesn't say, hey, give me back my cloak and try and wrestle it with her, which most of us probably would do. That's mine, give it me, and do it into tug of war. No, he just says, look, this is trouble. I'm out of here. And he looks for the door and he runs. He runs, leaving behind his cloak. I wonder if after that day he ever wore a cloak again. You know, twice bitten, that's fine. I'm not dealing with cloaks anymore. He runs away. And there are times in our lives when we are faced with temptations that we maybe have managed for a long period of time, and then all of a sudden that temptation ups the ante, and there's nothing for us to do but run. Look for the door and run. How are you doing that? What are the things you wrestle and struggle with? The things you know that Satan can tempt you with to take your eyes off God and cause you pain and problems. How are you dealing with it? Maybe you're at that stage where Joseph was, where you've managed around it, you've put all those parameters in place to protect yourself. Awesome. But be ready for that day when that isn't enough. Maybe this week you had to run. I say, awesome, thank you. Thank you for running. Maybe this week coming up will be the week that you will have to run. Will you have the courage to find the door and just get out? Because James tells us if we don't run when we're called to run or when we need to run, if we don't manage and get it out of our lives, that lust will lead to death. And Joseph runs not caring what the consequences are. Notice what the wife does. She's smart, I'm telling you. I think she lives out that quote, you've heard it before, from William Congreve. It says, heaven has no rage like love turned to hatred, to hatred turned, nor hell a fury like a woman scorned. Listen to what she does. First thing she does is she calls the servants in. She builds her case. Look, guys, do you recognize this coat? It's Joseph's, right? Let me tell you what happened. First, she plays the race card. This Hebrew that was brought to us. Then she plays the victim card. Made a fool of me, sport of me, intended to sleep with me, and I, the helpless woman, screamed. Here's my proof. The cloak. Don't you recognize it? And the rest of the day, she's just waiting for her husband to come home. Notice when the husband comes home, when Potiphar comes home, look what it says. Then she told him this story, verse 17. That Hebrew slave you brought us. She lays the blame on him. This is your fault, Potiphar, because you picked Joseph to come into our house. She goes on to talk about the race card again, this Hebrew, the fool card. Notice that she doesn't use the sex card, though. She plays the victim, though. And then it tells us that Potiphar gets angry. When I first read that, I assumed that Potiphar was getting angry at Joseph. Is that how you read it when you read that story? That Potiphar is angry at Joseph? But as I thought about it, I'm not so sure he's angry at Joseph. I think he's actually angry at his wife. And here's a couple of reasons why. I'm not saying this is totally scriptural, but here's my thoughts on it. One, slaves were property. He could do with Joseph whatever he wanted. Two, he is the chief of executioners. How easy is it for him to make sure Joseph does not live anymore? There is no reason why Joseph should have stayed alive. There's no reason why Potiphar should have been lenient to put him into prison. It just doesn't make sense in the culture of the day and what we know of Potiphar. 3, Potiphar, I think, knew his wife. Notice that he didn't put his wife in charge of the household. I think he knew how devious she was. And 4th, he knew Joseph. How do you turn your back on someone you've entrusted everything to that quickly? I wonder if he was getting angry at losing Joseph because he knew he had to save face. He knew he had to deal and do something to satisfy his wife because the reality is he had to live with her, right? And yet, how does he at least show some mercy to Joseph? What does he do? He puts him in the prison. The king's prison is told. And if you're going to find out next week, that prison is actually right where he's living. He's in charge of the prison. The captain of the guard, the chief executioner is the one. This prison that contained the enemies of Pharaoh, the people that Pharaoh did not like or was unhappy with. How does a slave get put into that prison unless it's the person in charge of that prison doing it? Just some things to think about it. And then we get to verse 20. And it says this: Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all of those held in the prison. He was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Does that make any sense? That a prison warden would turn over everything into of the prisoner to a prisoner. Look, buddy, you're a prisoner here, but I'm just going to let you run everything. That doesn't make sense. And yet it tells us the reason this happened is God was with Joseph, made him prosper, so much so that the warden, just like Potiphar, looked at Joseph and says, there is a guy. Regardless of how he came here, there's the guy I can trust. There is a man of integrity. You see, this passage, I think, in this chapter tells us that faithfulness is a call to persevere. In order to be faithful, we have to persevere. And oftentimes, persevere means starting over and over and over again. Joseph had to start all over again. I don't know how old he is when this happens, but the Bible tells us that last week we found out he was 17, and next week you're going to find out that he spends 2 years at the end of his prison time, and by the time he gets to become second in command with Pharaoh, he's 30. So that means for 11 years between when he was with his family, got sold into slavery, to when these 2 guys from Pharaoh's court come and visit him is 11 years. So for 11 years, he was a slave under Potiphar and then in prison. It doesn't tell us how quickly he became either one. But for 11 years, think about that. For 11 years, Joseph is faithful. He just continues to do the things that he's asked to do where he's at. It doesn't tell us that he dreams of escaping. It doesn't tell us that he plans escaping. He just does where he's at. He lives where he is placed. And Joseph has to start over again in prison. And yet, he does not act out of character. He does not let his circumstance dictate how he responds to the circumstances. He could have become bitter, I think, at this point. Okay, God, I wonder how many times he sat in his prison cell and he thought back to those dreams that we looked at last week where, his brothers and his father and mother were going to bow down to him. I think when he was with Potiphar, he goes, okay, I might have a chance now. But in prison? Like, God, are you mocking me? And yet, Joseph in prison continues to be the same person he was when he was in Potiphar's house. He continues to exercise his gifts. He continues to work hard. He continues to look at the situation and just be faithful. But as a reminder, faithfulness does not guarantee material success. Faithfulness to God doesn't mean that you will be successful materially. And I just want to leave this with you to think about. Notice, Joseph is always second. No matter how successful Joseph is, he is never first. He is always second. He is second after Potiphar. He is second after the prison warden. And then ultimately he is second after Pharaoh. And you say, wow, maybe if I could be second at that scale, I'd be okay. But the reality is, he's always second. So let me ask you, when you are tempted with material things, would you be satisfied if God prospered you enough that you were never number one? Would you be satisfied with whatever God is giving you now and not lusting after more? Would you be satisfied in just trying to live your life faithfully with what God has you doing now? Or is there this constant need or drive within you to have more? Jesus in Matthew 25 shares a parable, and he gives this parable of the talents, and he has 3 servants. He says, one gets 5 from the master, one gets 3, one gets 1, and some of you know the story. The master goes away for a while, then comes back, and the one with 5 gives 10 back, the one with 2 gives 4 back, and the one with 1 buried it and didn't do anything. What does the master say? The master doesn't say this, well done, good and successful servant. Does he? He says this, well done, good and faithful servant. It seems to me that God is more interested in our faithfulness than in our success. And you've been called to act faithfully, not to act successfully. You've been called to act faithfully wherever God has placed you, on whatever scale that is, whatever stage that is. Wherever you are, God is asking you to act faithfully. It's interesting if you study Revelation, the churches of Revelation in chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation, all the ones that Jesus says something good about, all have to do with them being faithful in some capacity. Whether it's persevering, whether it's enduring, or if you're lucky to be the church at Smyrna, to be faithful even to the point of death. And I will give you the crown of life, Jesus says. So the question I really want to get to you this morning is, where are you at in being faithful to God? Where is your faithfulness? Where is it based on? What is it based on? I think this passage shows that Joseph's faithfulness to God was based on his belief of who God was and is. And for us today, our faithfulness springs from our faith in God. Part of, I think, why Joseph could do what he did is he believed God was sovereign. He believed that God had control of his life. He, I think, put a lot of stock in those dreams that he shared with his brothers. And he was basing the fact that God had promised him something and he wasn't going to let go of that promise. And he knew something that we often forget, that God cannot be sovereign if he can't use either our sinful choices or the sinful choices of others to continue to work out his plan in our life. If God can't do that, then his sovereignty is limited and we have no hope. Do you realize that one name of Jesus that Revelation tells us is that Jesus' name is also faithful? The white rider on the white horse is named Faithful and True, and that is Jesus. We often talk about God is love and how much God and love are seen together. It's part of who God is. But with Jesus, it's faithfulness. He is the faithful son. He is the faithful servant. He is faithful. And so where are you at this morning? What things are going through your life? What circumstances are you facing? None of you are in prison, or else you wouldn't be here this morning. I understand that. Maybe online you're watching from prison. Maybe you know Joseph's situation a little better than the rest of us. But the reality is all of us face some hardships in life. All of us face things that we cannot handle on our own. How do you get through that? If Joseph were here this morning speaking to you, he would tell you, look, the only thing that'll help you get through everything is faithfulness in God. Be faithful to God because he is faithful to you and he will keep your promises, his promises. Verse 2 and verse 21 tells us everything Joseph needed to know to get through what he was facing. The Lord was with him. And that promise and that statement from those passages are the same statements that we can claim today if we know Jesus. Matthew 28:20, and surely I am with you always to the end of the age, is Jesus' promise to the disciples. Hebrews 13:5, because God said, I will never leave you, nor what? Forsake you. No matter what, I will be there for you is what God says to you, just like that father scraping the rocks for his son. It's the same promise. No matter what you face, no matter what you're going through, I will be there for you. No matter if your marriage is crumbling, no matter if you've lost your job at work, no matter if your kids are running wild, no matter what, I will be there for you. For those of you who are here this morning who maybe don't believe in God, or maybe when you think of God, you look at Jesus and you go, yeah, believing in Jesus, that's just a crutch. That's just something to help you get through what you need. As the song says, everyone needs someone to lean on. You cannot go through this life without facing something that you need, something outside yourself to get through. And God comes along and he says, look, I may not take you out of the circumstance you're in. In fact, if you're faithful to me, it might even get worse for a while. But all I'm asking you to do is to be faithful. And this is my promise. I will never leave you nor forsake you. I will be with you always. See, Charles Spurgeon has said this, to trust God in the light is nothing. But to trust him in the dark, that is faith. Christ is the only one that is truly faithful in a perfect sense. Where is your trust this morning? What are you trusting to get through the tough stuff in life? Is it Jesus? Is it God? Maybe this morning God is calling you to be faithful. Maybe God knows you're in a situation that is stretching you. And he's looking at you and he's going, will you act with integrity? Do the right thing. Trust me for the results. What is it? What is God calling you to be faithful in this morning? For some of you, it might be temptation. You've had a tough week. The boundaries you put in place collapsed. The door you should have run out of, you ran the other way and right into a wall. And maybe this day today is just a call and a reminder that God is there for you. He will forgive you. Your chance is to be faithful to him. Get back on the horse. Face that temptation. He will give you the strength to resist. Or maybe you're here this morning and you're just buried under the rubble. You're that little boy waiting for that dad to come and rescue him. And God is reaching down and pulling those rocks off you as we speak, saying, can you hear me? I'm on my way. Don't give up. Trust in me. Turn everything over to me. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I want to thank you for Joseph. God, I wonder sometimes that when we get to heaven, whether you won't have Joseph organizing something up there. God, he is a man of integrity. So much so that he acted in ways that he knew were right, regardless of the cost. And it cost him his job. It cost him favor with Potiphar. And it landed him in prison. And we like to talk about him because we already know what chapter 40 and 41 and 42 and on are. But that's not how life is now. God, you call us to have faithfulness in the moment. You call us to walk step by step, even when it's dark, just to trust in you. And so, God, I pray for those here this morning who just need a reaffirmation of that trust, a reaffirmation to the call to be faithful. Lord, I pray for those. I pray for those who are struggling with temptation, God. Give them the courage and strength that Joseph had. Give them that solid foundation to know what is right and wrong, and to know when they're getting too close to the edge. Lord, help us deal with the lusts in our heart. Help us not to dwell on them, think on them, but get rid of them, so that we too can have the integrity that Joseph had. Lord, I pray. I pray for those who just need to have someone pray for them this morning. I pray that they would come to the cross after the message here. I pray for those who just feel they need to make a public prayer to you, to be able to stand just like Joseph did and renew their faithfulness to you. God, but at the end of the day, I pray that you would speak to each one of us, so that each one of us, when we leave this place, will know that you are with us. You are for us. In Jesus' name, amen.